Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. In this episode, I talk about artificial intelligence with Dr. Falgun Chokshi, a radiologist. I'm a radiologist, he's a radiologist, and he's done a fair bit of work in this space, and we'll talk about his qualifications when I do the introduction on the interview portion of the podcast. But it's a topic that's very popular right now in the mainstream regarding not just medicine, but all types of places, professions are under threat, such as trucking, driving of all types, investments. Artificial intelligence is kind of a catch-all wastebasket term, but in radiology, we've been talking about it for a few years now at our national meetings, and you keep seeing the proponents and the people who hype it up quite a bit, saying that radiologists will be obsolete in 5 years. As I talk with Dr. Chokshi, I don't think that's the case, but there are going to be significant changes in the way we practice. Other fields, especially visual fields like pathology and dermatology, especially the ones who are not so procedural based, are also under the same type of risk. And honestly, algorithmic fields may also be at risk for. We may not need as many specialists in these various fields in the future. So, it obviously. The future is uncertain, but it is something that we're going to have to think about. And with the continued acceleration of the technology and how quickly it's coming to fruition, it may be here sooner than we think. And it may impact us sooner than we think in other fields. So anyway, I'd love to hear what you guys think about our artificial intelligence. And please shoot me an email at tarang@drmoneymatters.com, or you can respond and comments on the podcast on the website, drmoneymatters.com, or on Twitter, or at the Dr. Money Matters Facebook group. So are you making any plans for reduced income in the future based on threats from AI? I'm not sure that I am, and I'm not sure that I recommend anyone else do it, but it is a concern. So anyway, without waiting any longer, here's my interview with Dr. Chokshi. Welcome back to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. We're going to be talking today about artificial intelligence with Dr. Falgun Chokshi, a radiologist and an advisor to early-stage companies focusing on health tech and narrow-field AI plays in healthcare. He's involved in the national level with the Radiology Society of North America on the AI Standards Committee, and is a thought leader on the adoption of AI-related innovations and solutions for healthcare problems, with a focus on the business use cases and value generation for multiple stakeholders, particularly patients and physicians, which is what we care about. So, Dr. Chokshi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Tarang. I really appreciate it.
So, I appreciate you bearing with me. We've had a lot of technical issues trying to get this recorded, which hopefully AI will solve in the future. Let's talk about AI, and particularly in medicine. A lot of people, particularly you're a radiologist, I'm a radiologist, and we keep hearing kind of a diverging opinion. Worst case scenarios will be replaced in 5-10 years by artificial intelligence, and you won't need diagnostic radiologists. And then other people are more like, it's an adjunct to what we do, and don't worry about it. Don't worry about losing your job, things like that. And I'm probably a little bit in the middle of that. And so obviously I want to be prepared financially. And that's a lot of what we talk about on this podcast. But in the same time, I think a little bit of background of AI in medicine would be useful. So Can you kind of give us a quick blurb? I know it's a long topic, but about AI in medicine.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's a very poignant question. And honestly, there's a lot of confusion about this, mainly because I think there's a lot of misinformation and sort of lack of information out there. So just to take a step back and look at the 30,000-foot view on this, that the thing that we keep calling AI or artificial intelligence is really, it's become more of a marketing term than actually something of substance, because the AI that we're talking about here is something called narrow field AI. And what that means is that this is essentially a variation of a discipline of statistics and computer science called machine learning. And using high-end statistics and high-end computer programming and marrying them together in order to come up with computer programs and software that can actually adapt to different types of data that are coming in for training or for exposure or for a specific outcome. So when we talk about that, we're not talking about the replacement of any one profession or industry or job necessarily. Specifically, let's say in our case as physicians, right? And we both are radiologists, but really the discussion really should focus more on physicians and healthcare at large. What this technology really is that this is a technology that can help on a few different fronts. One is automation of a lot of repeatable, redundant tasks. So that's one use of it. Another use is to classify different types of data. So, for example, as a radiologist, or actually any specialist that deals with images, so dermatologists, ophthalmologists, etc., we deal with pictures, for lack of better words, right? That's how we explain it to patients sometimes. Like, hey, these are pictures, and we look at them and we try to figure out what they mean in a medical sense. Well, we're the original classifiers. We classify images and pictures into certain disease categories. When we say differential diagnosis, that's all that is. We're just classifying things. And so a computer can do that if you were to train it in the right way with the right type of sort of learning that it has to do initially. What it isn't is it's not something that's going to just supplant or replace humanity all of a sudden in 5-10 years. It's not something that's going to say that, oh, well, you're a radiologist or you're a dermatologist, ophthalmologist, or whatever, or an internist for that matter, and we're just going to take a lot of your jobs and tasks and we're just going to give it to some machine to do, and as if the machine's going to do every little bit of nuance that the physician, the doctor, can do. But what it is an opportunity for a lot of the variability that we run into in healthcare. So that could be variability in how patients are treated, variability on how patients treat themselves, a variability on how a practice is run, variability on how we make diagnoses. So there's all these different buckets where there's a lot of variability. And that variability is what we call the art of medicine in reality, right? But the problem with art is it's really in the eye of the beholder. So sometimes we practice in a way where other physicians or other stakeholders will be like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. This is by the standard of care. These are by guidelines, et cetera. And sometimes we have to practice in a way where we don't really have much in the way of guidelines. We don't have much in the way of high level evidence based medicine, and that's where the art comes in. Where AI or machine learning comes into play is that it can act as an adjunct to a lot of the functions that we do as physicians, and that adjunct would almost be like saying there's an assistant, and that's a more pragmatic way of approaching it. But I think a lot of people who go around saying, both in healthcare and those out in the investment community and venture capital and all that, and they keep saying, oh, this specialty is going to be replaced and that specialty is going to be replaced, are really speaking from a very position of ignorance. They keep thinking that they understand what it is that a lot of physicians do, when in reality they don't. And so they talk about things in a very juvenile way, but they don't understand that there's a lot of nuance that goes into a lot of what we do. So I'm not afraid of any, a machine replacing a radiologist. But there is a caveat to that those practices and those physicians that don't at least adopt the notion of having some type of assistive technology that's going to, help them in their day-to-day care of patients, are going to be left behind because they just won't be able to keep up with the times. It's that straightforward. So I hope I was able to answer a little bit on a sort of a big picture.
I think it's one of those questions. We've you obviously hear, like you said, from the companies that are trying to raise a bunch of venture capital firms, and obviously they will hype it up to best case or furthest out scenario in order to raise funds. And a lot of tech people, as we're well aware, just dealing with hospital-based tech, is they're not really certain of what we do. So I think you kind of clarified that pretty well. But the question would remain then, is it something that will decrease the number of physicians, whether it's radiologists or internists or pathologists, whatever, would a radiologist with AI augmented practice be able to do the work of 5 radiologists? And basically, similarly, how we, in other specialties, they're using mid-level providers to help. Obviously, that's not the same thing as AI, but basically decrease, or expand their scope of practice or in terms of numbers. Do you see that happening with AI?
Yeah. Actually, your question is a little bit more of a super question in the sense that there's a lot of stuff packaged in there that maybe we should unpack, because there's a few aspects of this that don't really directly relate to AI, but they relate to how costs are incorporated into practice management. So let me just take the AI side of things, right? And jobs, as you said, right? So will you need as many doctors out there in the future that are doing the same things as they are doing today if they have assistive technologies that can help, number one, decrease the variability in, let's say, diagnosis or therapeutic outcome. Number two, automate a lot of redundant, highly repetitive, work. Or number three, make the process of getting a patient going through, let's say, a particular practice or a particular diagnostic / therapeutic, pathway. If they can make it more optimized meaning, less side effects from improper medications, less misdiagnosis, less getting essentially, having to go to like 5-6 different doctors in order to get, a diagnosis that should have been done earlier in the pathway. If those things are what AI can help us do, which is what the promise is, then you actually technically don't need as many doctors. But the only way you're going to find that out is there's a set of analyses that really a lot of these national health organizations like the AMA and a lot of the specialty specific organizations really should commission, and those are workforce extrapolation studies. And all that means is to say that, look, if we came up with certain conditions, if we said that, let's say you have a radiologist that reads X number of CTs and MRIs in a day, and now you had an assistive technology that was AI powered, and that would, let's say, let that radiologist read X plus a certain percentage, or would actually read a percentage of what the radiologist does, and the radiologist just checks it off. For example, chest X-rays for ICU films. There is opacity, no opacity, pleural effusion, no pleural effusion, pneumothorax, no pneumothorax, and a line or tube if they may have changed. So kind of 4 classes of things. If you're able to do that, and if you think about it from a practice and business standpoint, you don't need as many people. That's really what it is. But not all specialties will behave the same way. Those that are very high touch, high demand, high interaction with patients are probably more protected, because there's the nuance of being able to go to your doctor and saying, I spent this much time, and that's even becoming more rare as time goes on, under a lot of these large healthcare systems and, kind of a HMO type of paradigm of 15, 17 minutes a patient or whatnot. But then you have the specialties like ours in radiology, where we are completely beholden to technology, right? Our PAC system goes down, we can't work, and so on and so forth. So in those scenarios, it's not that radiology will go away. It's just that you may not need as many radiologists, you may not need as many ophthalmologists, or whatever it may be. So this is not meant to be like to facilitate like scaring people, but this is just a reality of things. Is that since automation came through in the industrial age, you didn't need as many people to work in factories. This has been historically proven in other industries, right? And healthcare, as unusual of an industry as it is, still follows a lot of the same paradigms. Is that, for example, here's another part of your question. Let's unpack. We talk about APPs and nurse practitioners, PAs, and whatnot, and people have mixed feelings about either being seen by someone who's not a physician or hiring someone who in their own practice that may not be a medical MD or DO. Well, if you look, that is not necessarily a medical decision. It's more of a business decision where you can get someone who maybe would do a very defined, narrow task. For example, in radiology, a great example would be someone who is doing, non-vascular abdominal drainage procedures like paracenteses, thoracenteses, or whatnot, and you train that person to just do that task within a very strict amount of parameters, and they're supervised by a physician, then all of a sudden you just cut your cost by almost a half to more than 60, 70%, because that person's not getting paid as much as a physician would get paid. So if you were to take those type of aspects and then you say, oh, well, can I leverage technology to help me do this stuff? Can I have an ultrasound probe that's linked up to a cloud-based server that's able to identify things on the fly? That would be very useful, I would imagine, to a lot of doctors, right? And all of a sudden you identify anatomy or pathology in real time or whatnot. So the issue is not really that the technology is here to threaten us as physicians or to help or not. The technology is always amoral. It's only how people use it. And the biggest driver of how people will use it in healthcare is going to really be what is, number one, primarily, is there a detriment or risk of using the technology for the purposes of patient safety and patient outcomes? So that's going to be the primary sort of level in this kind of pyramid. And then the second level is going to be, what's the business use case? I tell people all the time when I advise startups, I tell them no one's going to buy your algorithm, right? They want to buy a product. They want to buy something that solves an actual problem that they have. Otherwise, who cares, right? And a lot of startups, they focus on the algorithm. Say, our thing could detect chest nodules, this much accuracy and all that. I'm like, yeah, that's great, but no one's going to buy it because it's just an algorithm. Like if you have a smartphone, like I have an iPhone. I didn't buy the iPhone for the algorithms. I bought it because it's an awesome product. At least so you buy the product, and I think that's where you'll see a lot more coming out as far as now people start selling products instead of harping on algorithms. And I think that's where a lot of confusion comes in amongst physicians, because they're just like, well, I don't even know what to do with this stuff. Like, what does this mean that, Google has an algorithm that's able to detect diabetic retinopathy on fundal images as good as, 18 or 16 or whatever it was, ophthalmologist? Well, what does that mean? What does it mean in my practice? Is there a product I can buy that's going to help me, find this in patients? And that
I was going to say, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say that I think that's where medicine and healthcare becomes a little bit different than other professions, right? Because, for example, we're AI in terms of self-driving vehicles and, what the potential impact is going to be on truck drivers, which is obviously a huge industry in the U.S. Similarly, like you said, it's part of the industrial evolution that technology happens and it ends up being utilized. And then historically, people have been displaced from their professions. And then those people may have been hurt, but the next generation of people, were able to then do something different. What the concern is, and I think this is where it becomes such a tough thing for those young people in medicine, is that you've already spent a pretty significant time period of training, and then if you add on, a field that's potentially threatened in terms of, like we're saying, radiology, in terms of maybe you might need fewer radiologists, or even if you don't need fewer radiologists, this will help potentially drive down costs. You just that lag time tends to be such a detriment, that you start getting, okay, I've spent 4 years in med school, 6 years by the time you do a fellowship in radiology. And now I may have to retrain because the next 10 years beyond that is such we don't know what's happening. So I guess that's the part that changes it. Obviously, no matter what, whether the truckers are facing an indeterminate future or whether it's physicians, no one's going to cry about that for those professions who are outside of the profession. But it's just that's the toughest thing that I think about AI. People have a hard time. Like what you're talking about with the Google being able to detect diabetic retinopathy. You're right. Right now, it's such an early process, right? But what I guess the concern from someone not in the field is that the evolution of AI for the most part, was pretty out of our. It wasn't in the mainstream. We didn't really understand what's happening, and then by the time we start talking about it, it's that curve, like that adoption curve that you talk about in business case, where it's an exponential growth all of a sudden, right? And so it seems like nothing happens, and then boom, a lot of stuff happens, and then before we know it, it's upon us. And that doesn't follow that 4-year training window of an ophthalmology residency. That's where I guess my question is, we know these things are going to happen. Technology is going to happen. And the overriding factor, like you said, patient protection, safety, and costs. And basically, if technology can provide a similar level of safety, then the costs are going to drive the next level of concern. And so, well, okay, I was going to ask you this. What would you advise someone who's going into med school now in terms of not necessarily what field to go into, because no one knows, but what would you just give them as a broad advice? Obviously, still healthcare is a great and medicine is a great career. And I don't think doctors are going to be rendered unnecessary in the future. And, based on all the stuff that you just said, but I do think that people should be a little bit more agile. And do you think that may change training ideas in medicine? Maybe residencies won't be so long, and maybe you can kind of shift around. I mean, this is a very broad question.
Yeah, it's a very relevant question. So, my thoughts on the overall landscape that we all went through, right, in order to get into med school, get into internship, residency, fellowship, and then the attending life. And your listeners are somewhere in that spectrum, I would assume, right? Someone's either in med school or an attending or somewhere in between. My thoughts on it is that, and this is just not me. There's other people in our profession who feel similar, but probably say it in different ways. Is that we as a profession tend to be very glacial in the way change happens. So we don't adapt to things fast. And the reason why is just because of the nature of the profession, right? I was telling residences, I'm like, everybody enters med school like a bunch of lions, and then they come out like a bunch of sheep, because that's what happens. You go in, you're ambitious, and you're going to change the world, and everyone has some variant of some altruism, with some variant of some capitalism, and some variant of some personal anecdote, a loved one that got sick, and etc. And then everyone goes in, and then everyone comes out kind of as a replaceable worker bee, in a sense. At least that's how it is nowadays. And the sad fact about it is that socialization as part of our profession keeps us from thinking differently. Apple had a very famous ad back in the 80s about think differently, and Steve Jobs, you say, everybody, as a cliche, they always tout a lot of sayings from Silicon Valley. But, one of the things you have to understand is the whole think differently issue is a very significant one, because So you put in so much, like you said, you put in so much time, energy, resources, sacrifice. People are coming out with hundreds and thousands of dollars of loans to pay back. So you're entering into this vicious cycle, right? Where you're just sitting there, look, I did all this just to get here, and now you're telling me I got to worry about this, and this. I got to worry about a technology, whatever. But the issue is that the medical education system has to change with, but my fear is that the medical education system is not going to change anytime soon, because the people who run the medical education system are not exactly the most think differently type of personalities. They're going to do whatever they've been doing unless there's such a groundswell need to say, for example, from our neck of the woods, does a radiologist really need to do a 5-year residency or a 4-year residency plus an internship? I don't think they do. But then again, no one's going to listen to me because I'm not in that education, world. But I would say other specialties may be the same way. But people don't want to change also because they don't know what the change will amount to. And we inherently as a profession are extremely risk averse folks, right? Because the last thing we want is something bad to happen to someone we're taking care of. And that's a very legitimate concern. Except the forces that come into healthcare who are not providers or physicians specifically, they don't look at it that way. They look at it in terms of opportunity. So it's ironic. A lot of doctors that you talk to, which I imagine a lot of your listeners go through the same thing that a lot of us do, where you go to someone's house or, a play date with your kids or you go to a dinner party or something with a bunch of other doctors. The conversation is usually the same old stuff. And all the doctors are thinking, hey, everyone else is unusual. We're normal. Our profession's normal. This is how it should be. Whereas when you think of the rest of the world, they look at us and say, you guys are all weird. Like the rest of the world doesn't operate by the principles that you guys trained under. And that's where the clash between what you just said about other groups that come into medicine and healthcare and to try to leverage technology to do, to solve this problem or to displace this group or to quote unquote disrupt, some aspect of the industry, even though a lot of these people have nothing to do with healthcare. They might have made their money doing financial tech or something, or they used to be on Wall Street or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, it's a very Darwinian system. That's what doctors don't understand. I think a lot of physicians feel that just because we trained a certain way and we went through a certain set of rigors and sort of indoctrination that other people in healthcare did. And that's not true.
I think it's a very good point because, like you said, we've been glacial, and the main reason we've been glacial, honestly, was because if any radical shifts could have catastrophic patient care outcomes. And so historically, we've been conservative as a profession in medicine, and rightfully so. But like you said, everyone outside of it who hasn't participated directly in the patient care or to a much smaller degree in terms of responsibility is pushing for harder and faster and, more abrupt changes. And you're right. We have to be aware of it. We have to recognize that maybe there are certain things that we cannot be glacial in any longer. But like exactly what you said, it's that leadership at that top end who makes those decisions. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
And one aspect, if I may, let me give you a short example of why there's so much confusion and inherent sort of almost an adversarial approach right now in healthcare amongst, let's say, physicians and their understanding or lack of understanding of AI-related technologies, and then those who are trying to produce them. So founders and companies and et cetera, right? Or investors who are funding them. So take the example of let's go back into the world of pharma, right? A medication, right? So take the example of statins. When statins first, or any medication, right? Any medication has to go to different stages of FDA approval, and then you have randomized controlled trials, and then there's a set of high-level evidence, quote unquote, and there's controversy even amongst in that world as well as to how certain interventions or medications become standard of care. right? In modern medical practice. If you're a founder of a company who's trying to make algorithms that are just going to detect something, but not diagnose something, right? There's a difference. The FDA actually makes a distinction between detecting something, so that's like an adjunct, versus diagnosis. Is now you're saying, oh, well, look, a machine's going to actually make a diagnosis. Well, you don't actually want to get your technology in a randomized controlled trial. What if the trial shows your technology sucks? What happens to all that money that you just got by marketing your AI algorithm? When you talk to physicians about it, the physician is going to be like, no, this technology should go through a trial. This algorithm should, you should go through a trial. And if you go on Twitter or other social media outlets, you'll see this kind of banter going on over and over again among certain doctors who feel that way and other people who don't. But the issue is that people just respond to their incentives and what they can do. So it will be very unusual to see AI algorithms actually go through randomized controlled trials unless the people making those algorithms are so confident that that algorithm is going to increase or better the outcome, some type of primary, secondary outcome, just the way we do in trials, more traditional trials, for a certain endpoint, right? But the vast majority don't want that, because if you're an investor in a company, the thing you want is a return on your investment. You don't actually want to increase the risk of your investment failing. And that's how it works. And this is why when people complain, like especially doctors I know, they'll say, well, they don't do trials on this stuff. I'm like, well, look at it from their perspective. They don't want to be shown to be inferior or whatnot. They just want to sell their product. The best example of a technology we use every day that never went through randomized controlled trials and yet through various maneuvers was instituted is the EMR.
That's a whole other podcast about the EMR. But
and I don't even want to get into that mind.
Right.
But I'm just letting you understand that we've already seen when that adversarial sort of landscape develops. And so I think a lot of times physicians sometimes mix up what is AI enabled versus what is something that's clinically relevant as a technology versus something that's just going to help your practice run better versus something that's going to help you extract more money in billing and coding, et cetera. I think there's a lot of confusion, and it's marketed in a confusing way too.
You're right. I think that's a great point, because you always have to remember, and this goes to the thing, follow the money. What does the money want to happen? And it's true. You're right. Why put yourself up at a higher risk for going through the trial when potentially the positive outcome may be of a trial, while it may be useful and give you a little bit more of a leg up, may not be worth the downside risk of not going through it. So I think that's a good point. Let me ask you this, because one of the questions, if you have a moment, so one of the questions that people always bring up whenever we talk about AI in healthcare, the two examples that we always hear is, well, I've seen EKG, automated reading from EKGs forever, and they haven't replaced cardiologists, and they're still not very good. And I haven't been reading EKGs in years, so you could, But I think that was one of the older, uses. And then in radiology, we always had that first generation of CAD, computer-aided detection for mammography, and mostly that caused more headache than it was worth. And so, so most doctors now, at least who are probably, I would say, a decade out of training and are not necessarily involved in direct, AI related research or products, and just in general clinical practice, they kind of poo-poo it a little bit. And so what I'm going to ask you is, what is an example that right now of something in AI that's actually being done well, and it is potentially, whether it's a threatened replacement of a physician or not, is just a good kind of a thing that's happening in AI that can be used as an example to say, no, it is different than it was previously, and it is actually making a difference.
Sure. Yeah. So going to the initial part of your comment about these other technologies like CAD, computer aided diagnosis or detection and whatnot, and all these, they sort of put a bad taste in a lot of physicians' mouths, so to speak, about, okay, how is this technology really supposed to help as opposed to, making our lives more difficult. One thought on that is that, as with a lot of different technologies, so, I'll go back to the notion of smartphones, right? If you think back to like movies from 1980s, when you have those, people riding around in high-end cars with those huge bricks on their ears, and they really look like bricks that were cell phones with like ridiculous high radiation doses and long antenna. And now you fast forward, what has it been, 30 years now? Almost 30 something years, and you look at what you have in your pocket. That's the analogy I would give to a lot of the technology we use in healthcare. Now, with the understanding that in healthcare in general, we move much slower. We're usually on average about 9 to 10 years behind other industries for the similar type of technology. So just think about that. If you're already a decade behind, you're going to function the way another industry was a decade behind, than you. So having said that, where are these AI technologies coming in handy right now? Let's say, right now we're in the foreseeable 3 or 4 years. So from a non-clinical standpoint, these technologies are very helpful when it comes to the field of fintech, or financial technology. And what does that mean for doctors? Well, you run a practice, right? Or you're part of a practice. Either you're a partner in a practice, you're an employee, you may be an administrator, whatever it is, right? Or you're in a big healthcare system. At the end of the day, they're all businesses. Like, whether you like to call them that, and if you think money's evil, it's not. It's really irrelevant, because the reality of it is that they're all businesses, and you need to maximize your profits as a business in an ethical way as possible, right? So these technologies are very useful for that. And the reason why is they can give you insights into how your costs are and your income streams are, your revenue, all of these things, which are essentially general business practices and accounting practices, can be automated and laid out to you as the person operating that medical business. So that's where it's very, really helpful right now, actually. The clinical side of things is where it gets a little bit more dicey. And the reason why is because the regulation, we're a very highly regulated industry, right, for many reasons. And that's where it gets pretty interesting, in the sense that if you're looking for what I talked about before with randomized controlled trials, it's very difficult to get someone to do a randomized controlled trial using AI as the thing you're comparing conventional conventional medical care to, let's say, like control intervention type of, type of setup. There have been, I think, 1 or 2 studies that came out that actually looked at AI algorithms to look for abnormal findings on mammograms, which is interesting because that's what CAD was initially developed for anyway. But if you shouldn't mistake AI related algorithms with CAD. CAD doesn't learn anything. Again, it's the big brick you put on your ear in the 1980s, right? Now we're in the era of smartphones, and now the technology we use is much more sophisticated. So one of the uses of this technology is that you could actually, instead of having 2 people read mammograms, you could actually have a machine and a physician read a mammogram. So you could instead of having 2 breast imagers reading the same mammogram, you could have 1 breast imager and a machine, and that would be a way to adjudicate findings. So that's just one early example. We hear a lot about talking about chest nodules and in radiology especially. And then, we hear about the stuff in ophthalmology with like the fundal, exams. There's people working on dermatology related applications with biopsies, images and whatnot. Those things are in the works. I think they will come out as adjuncts, as assistants. Like, you just take your smartphone out, take a picture of that really abnormal looking mole, and then it's going to tell you, hey, what are the chances this thing's going to be, this thing needs to come out or not, or this thing is looking abnormal or not. A fundoscopic scan. And these are the things that are going to be made into products. So I would say within about the next 5 to 6 years, the conversation will shift or start shifting from algorithms to products. That, hey, I bought this product that so-and-so makes, and it's great because it helps my diabetic patients with this problem. Or I bought this type of, and some companies are doing that with imaging. Some companies are doing that even with EKGs and cardiology related issues. They're trying to do it. The other issue that people, I think, a lot of times don't discuss, especially amongst physicians, just because they're not, purview to the conversation, is really what are the business models of these companies? Because at the end of the day, the company might have an amazing technology, but if they don't know how to monetize it, they're not going to survive. So I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of decision makers in healthcare practices, whether it's a smaller group or a huge healthcare organization, they're very apprehensive about investing in AI-related technologies within their own institutions. And when I say investing, I'm not talking about investing in a company as an investor.
Right.
I'm just talking about
buying the product or
buying
the technology. Yeah. I think that's similar. I mean, AI is kind of at the stage. Maybe it was about 5-6 years ago. We heard a lot about 3D printing, and it hyped up really quickly, and then it kind of faded off. I mean, that technology is still phenomenal, but it didn't. That the early adopters were probably not getting the return. Like you said, it's an investment for any product. It's an investment, so they're not getting the return that they may have initially thought. Now, in that next generation of 3D printing, when it becomes maybe more mainstream and lower cost, it'll probably turn out to be something very useful. But, maybe we're not there yet. Listen, I don't want to keep you too long. I wanted to ask one other thing. And it's similar to, again, I go back to the AI in self-driving vehicles. The concern is always, okay, even if you have 1 million autonomous driving vehicles on the road, and in this case, AI in healthcare, who's going to accept liability for it? And that's always, the defense that physicians use, saying I'm not that worried about it. Any thoughts on that type of? And again, this may be out of your realm, but just want to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. No, it's actually a great point you brought up, and I'm glad you actually brought it up. And I don't have a legal background, so I can't speak to it from a legal standpoint, but from a sort of from a business and practice standpoint, it's ironic because the thing that most physicians, if not all physicians, are afraid of, being named in a lawsuit or whatnot, is ironically the thing that sort of protects you as a physician, at least in America, in the United States of America. And here's the rationale behind it, right? Again, you have to forget you're a physician, and you have to look at it from the perspective of the person making the technology, right? The product is that you don't ever, if I'm making a new software that is going to detect some disease, et cetera, the last thing I want is my software causing any undue harm to anyone else, right? But secondarily, if I'm the investor in the company, or if I'm the actual CEO of the company, I also don't want to ever get sued. I don't want to get sued because I have a company, and the same way a physician doesn't want to get sued is the same way a healthcare organization doesn't want to get sued, and it's the same way a corporation doesn't want to get sued. No one ever wants to get sued. So what do? You mitigate all your risk. How do physicians do it? Well, number one, you practice extremely carefully, and we all know the term for practicing a little over carefully in that term. But you take out insurance, right? That's why you have liability insurance. Well, how do you mitigate liability when you're a startup or you're early stage company and you position yourself so that you're actually not driving decisions. You let the doctor make the decision. You say, hey, there's this finding, go. And then the doctor says, okay, I thank you for showing me blah, blah, blah. I don't care about it, or yeah, oh, thank God this thing picked it up. I'm going to go and recommend an additional study or get lab work or whatever it is. So the risk aspect of it, and risk is a very weird abstract notion because most people don't understand what risk is. I mean, it's very hard to conceptualize what risk is. But what you're always doing is you're always trying to drive down your risk. And the entire game in risk is you never get rid of it, you just displace it. And that's what physicians need to understand is if you're dealing with a company that's trying to sell you a product, are they displacing the risk onto you or your practice? Or have they addressed that in some way? Do they have insurance? Do they have et cetera? And these are things you should be asking because more and more practices are going to get approached by companies, either legacy companies like, the Epics, the Cerners and so on and so forth of the world, insurance companies, and then you're going to be, and then the thousands and thousands of startups that come and they're trying to sell you their wares. So, this is very important because this is where physicians can really get burnt. You don't want to buy a lemon. So that's where risk is important. And it's sad to say that's probably one of the reasons why we'll have some job security.
I 100% agree with that because if you look, Apple's the new version of the watch, right, has a much more robust EKG kind of or heart rhythm tracking. But they brought it down just a little bit so that, they didn't have to accept any real liability on it. And then it, of course, goes to, the caveat is always go speak with your physician, just like every pharmaceutical ad that you see on TV or, advanced, at least as of now, advanced practice providers, still have the caveat that the physician is ultimately responsible. And so, yeah. I 100% agree that, right now, the thing that we all hate is protecting us. And
yeah, it's ironic.
Yeah. But hey, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to thank you. This is, very clear, very good, useful information. And I think it's just, it's one of those things that we're going to keep hearing more and more about. And I think most doctors, particularly those early to mid-career, should be aware. And I'm not saying that you should, change your career plans at all based on AI. And in fact, one of the things that I feel like, well, if we're going to be, in theory replaced, and I'm not saying that we are, almost any profession, whether it's an MBA doing business case analysis, drivers, whatever, all these people are going to be at risk. So don't change your career based just on threats of AI.
Yeah, but just be savvy about it. Keep in the know. Ask if you don't know. There's a lot of people out there that have a lot of burgeoning interest and some level of thought leadership and expertise, and reach out. Like I think that's the biggest thing. I think physicians are very good about that. We will ask each other and leverage our network very effectively. So this is no different.
Right. Well, hey, Falgun, I want to thank you just for coming on and explaining this to us. And I want to give a shout out because you are pretty well researched, good background in this. So I want to talk about if anyone wants to get in touch with you and read more about what your thoughts are on this, give me your website again to do that.
Sure. Yeah. Feel free to. I have my own website. It's falgunchokshi.com. So that's FALGUNCHOKSHI.com, and feel free to reach out through there. And I'm on Twitter as well, and Falgun Chokshi MD is my handle.
Perfect. We'll put a link to those on the show notes. But thank you. This gives us a lot to ponder in our future, and I just think we have to be aware and realize this. One of the things that I always think about is when I was in the Air Force, it was the start of drone technology. And so pilots, quite rightfully so, the true fighter pilots, the one who had trained through the significant training, would always, look at it a little bit skeptically. And now, 15 years down the line, it's one of the biggest components of intelligence gathering. It used to be the pilots were kind of like the ones who were doing the drone piloting were kind of looked at as, secondary to the true fighter pilots. And I'm not back in the Air Force now, but I think that those things are changing just because the role for drone pilots are increasing. So, we're kind of in a similar aspect. And to train an old traditional way of fighter pilot training used to be a massive investment, much more so than physician investment training was. So, things do change, and we just kind of have to keep aware of that. But hey, I don't want to keep you too long. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Darren. I really appreciate it. And thanks to your listeners for listening.
I want to thank Dr. Chokshi for coming on the podcast. And it's a fascinating topic, AI. It still seems somewhat nebulous because most of us have not been directly impacted. But as I said in the interview, it's one of those things that is happening kind of in the background and we don't really notice it. And then all of a sudden, it'll be here. So I certainly foresee that in this decade, there will be significant changes in the way we practice. Probably not so much in the first 5 years, but by 2027, 28, it's going to be pretty impactful. But again, the time is irrelevant. I just see the technology changing the way we practice medicine, hopefully for the good, but you never know. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Dr. Money Matters. If this is the first episode you have heard, I appreciate you taking the time out and listening and encourage you to listen to our past episodes. I would also appreciate you leaving me a positive review on Apple Podcasts and also recommend you join our Facebook group where we have ongoing discussions about this and other topics in order to help each other reach our financial goals. Finally, I encourage you to subscribe to our email list and also to subscribe to the podcast itself on the various podcast app that you use in order to be kept aware when the latest episode comes out. More episodes of this podcast are available at www.drmoneymatters.com and on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Audio versions are also available on YouTube and Facebook. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Money Matters or on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Money Matters, all spelled out. Thanks for listening, and if you get a chance, please leave a positive review for this podcast as it helps move the podcast up the rankings on iTunes and gets it exposed to a wider audience. Thanks for listening once again, and stay tuned for another episode coming soon.